The earliest cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Eridu contain a detail that conventional archaeology has never satisfactorily explained. Among the thousands of clay fragments excavated from the deepest occupation layers of this site, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city ever constructed, archaeologists discovered references to beings who possess complete knowledge of urban planning, hydraulic engineering, and astronomical calculation before a single Mesopotamian city had been built. These references do not describe gradual learning or experimental development. They describe inherited wisdom, transmitted in its complete form, from sources that predate recorded history entirely. The Sumerian civilization emerged around 3500 BC, with what scholars have repeatedly described as startling suddenness. Within an archaeologically brief window, the inhabitants of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley demonstrated mastery of mathematics, metallurgy, astronomy, irrigation engineering, and administrative organization at levels that took other cultures centuries or millennia to approximate. The standard archaeological model, which expects gradual technological accumulation from simple to complex, finds no expression in the Sumerian record. The earliest artifacts display refinement. The earliest texts display sophistication. The earliest cities display planning. What the Sumerians themselves recorded about this discontinuity is more unsettling than the discontinuity itself. Their founding documents, their creation narratives, their king lists, and their administrative records consistently attribute their knowledge to beings they called the Abgallu, the great sages, and the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. These accounts were not written as mythology. They were written as administrative history, in the same dry, precise language used to record grain deliveries and labour quotas, and within them, embedded between flood chronologies and astronomical tables, are traces of a civilization so much older than Sumer that its existence forces a fundamental reconsideration of everything we believe about the human past. The evidence we are about to examine spans multiple continents and thousands of years, drawing connections between Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, pre-dynastic Egyptian burial practices, underwater ruins submerged since the last ice age, and astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments that conventional timelines cannot explain. If this investigation challenges what you believed about the origins of human civilization, consider following this channel as we continue to pursue what the earliest human records were actually trying to tell us. The Sumerians recorded their own origin story with the precision of engineers rather than the embellishment of mythmakers, and nowhere is this more evident than in the founding documents of Eridu, the city their records identify as the first settlement ever established on Earth. The tablet designated CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, written in archaic Sumerian script that predates standard cuneiform by several centuries, describes 7 primary sages called the Abgallu, who descended before the first city was raised and brought with them the divine decrees governing every aspect of civilized existence, from the construction of temples to the calculation of astronomical cycles. The tablet does not present these beings as metaphorical ancestors or spiritual ideals. It presents them as historical actors who arrived at a specific time, performed specific functions, and transmitted specific knowledge to specific human recipients. The language is administrative, the tone is documentary, and the implications are extraordinary. The 7 Abgallu are identified in the CBS 10673 text and in related tablets from the Nippur collection by individual names and individual domains. The first sage, Adapa, whose name translates approximately as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth, is described as possessing comprehensive knowledge of the fundamental structures of reality, including the proper procedures for maintaining what the texts call the cosmic bond, the mechanisms by which celestial order translated into terrestrial stability. The second sage, Aswana, appears in multiple independent Mesopotamian sources, including the account of the Babylonian priest historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, who describes him as an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity the foundations of civilized existence in a single continuous lecture that, according to Berossus, covered everything that would ever be necessary. The remaining 5 sages, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, and Utwabzu, each governed specific technical domains ranging from agricultural science to medical knowledge to astronomical calculation, and each is documented in the cuneiform record not as a mythological personage, but as a historical figure associated with a specific city, a specific king, and a specific period of instruction. What distinguishes the Abgallu text from ordinary Mesopotamian religious literature is a quality that scholars have noted but rarely foregrounded in their analyses: the absence of narrative embellishment. Mesopotamian mythology is generally characterized by dramatic conflict, divine emotion, and narrative complexity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Descent of Inanna all display the hallmarks of literary composition. The Abgallu texts display none of these qualities. They read like personnel records. They specify who arrived, what knowledge they transmitted, who received it, and what was subsequently accomplished. The Babylonian scholar Berossus, who had access to temple archives at Babylon that no longer exist, described these records in terms that suggest he understood them to be historical documentation rather than religious literature, noting that the writing of history in Mesopotamia began with the arrival of the first sage, implying that what preceded this arrival was not history but prehistory, a period before records because there was nothing yet worth recording. The archaeological evidence from Eridu itself provides a physical context for understanding why these textual traditions emerged from this particular location. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 revealed a settlement sequence of extraordinary depth and continuity, with the lowest occupation layers containing artifacts whose technical refinement created immediate problems for conventional developmental models. The earliest pottery from Eridu, classified as Eridu ware and dating to approximately 5500 BC, displays geometric decoration based on precise mathematical relationships that archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom later demonstrated encoded accurate knowledge of celestial cycles. The fact that this encoding appears in the earliest recovered material from the site, rather than emerging gradually through centuries of refinement, suggests the knowledge was introduced rather than developed. The linguistic analysis of the Sumerian and Akkadian terms used to describe the Abgallu and their activities reinforces the interpretation of these beings as historical rather than mythological. The Sumerian word Abgallu combines ab, meaning ocean or deep water, with gal, meaning great, and lu, meaning man or person, producing a composite designation that translates most accurately as the great men of the deep waters. This terminology is not the language of divine beings in the conventional Mesopotamian sense. It is descriptive language that characterizes these entities by their origin or their association with a specific domain, rather than by their supernatural attributes. The Akkadian term Abgallu, derived from the same root, carries connotations of wisdom and counsel that emphasize function over essence. These beings were defined by what they knew and what they did, not by what they were. The cuneiform record, read on its own terms rather than through the filter of later mythological interpretation, presents the Abgallu as a technical cadre whose purpose was knowledge transmission and whose legacy was the civilization that emerged immediately and fully formed in the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia. The question that their texts implicitly raise, and that the physical evidence of early Eridu makes unavoidable, is where this knowledge originated before it was transmitted. Among the most studied and least explained documents in the entire corpus of ancient Near Eastern literature is the Sumerian King List, preserved across multiple independent copies, including the Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a four-sided clay object inscribed during the reign of King Utu-Hengel of Uruk around 2100 BC, but clearly drawing from sources far older than its physical composition. The list divides Mesopotamian history into two absolute categories separated by a single catastrophic event, presenting pre-flood rulers with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, and post-flood rulers with reigns that, while still extraordinary by modern standards, represent a dramatic reduction that the text itself treats as a measurable consequence of the deluge. The standard academic response to the antediluvian reign lengths has been to dismiss them as mythological exaggeration, symbolic of dynastic periods rather than individual lifespans, or as scribal misreadings of earlier numerical systems. None of these explanations has proven satisfactory, and several face direct contradiction from the internal evidence of the text itself. The Well-Blundell prism preserves 8 antediluvian kings ruling from 5 cities, with combined reign lengths totaling 241,200 years. The individual reigns are recorded with a precision that sits uneasily alongside the hypothesis of mythological invention. Alulim of Eridu is credited with 28,800 years. Alalngar, also of Eridu, with 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibera with 43,200 years. These are not round numbers. They are specific figures, and their specificity carries mathematical significance that scholars including Livio Catulo Stecchini and later Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von der Schend identified in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill. Every antediluvian reign length in the King List is a multiple of 3,600. The number the Sumerians designated as 1 Sar. 3,600 was not an arbitrary unit. It was the highest named number in the Sumerian mathematical system, and it appears throughout Mesopotamian astronomy and cosmology as a fundamental organizing constant. The antediluvian reigns are not mythological inventions. They are calculated periods, expressed in a specific unit of temporal measurement, whose astronomical significance the Sumerian scribes understood precisely. The post-flood section of the King List demonstrates this distinction through contrast. After the kingship descended from heaven a second time following the deluge, the reign lengths drop dramatically, but do not drop to historically plausible durations immediately. Etana of Kish is credited with 1,560 years, Enmebaragasi of Kish with 900 years. The progressive reduction continues through successive dynasties until, by the time historically verifiable kings appear in the record, reign lengths have contracted to figures that correspond to normal human lifespans. This graduated compression is not the pattern of mythological invention, which tends toward uniformity or dramatic contrast. It is the pattern of an accurate record documenting a real change in the biological parameters of human rulership, a change that the text itself attributes to the flood and its aftermath. The King List treats the antediluvian reigns not as symbolic expressions of greatness, but as data points in a long chronological sequence that was understood to be continuous and factual. The mathematical relationships embedded in the antediluvian figures extend beyond simple multiples of the Sar unit into patterns that encode astronomical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. The total of 241,200 years for all 8 antediluvian reigns, when divided by the Sar value of 3,600, yields 67.0 years, a figure that does not immediately suggest astronomical significance. But when the individual reign lengths are analysed against the precessional cycle of 25,920 years, a different picture emerges. The reign of Enmengalana, recorded as 28,800 years, equals exactly 1 1/11th precessional cycles, while the combined reigns of the first 2 kings of Eridu, 64,800 years, equal exactly 2.5 precessional cycles. The consistency of these relationships across independent documents and independent copies of the King List argues against coincidence, and toward deliberate astronomical encoding by scribes who understood precession millennia before Hipparchus claimed its discovery. The independent confirmation of these figures in non-Mesopotamian sources strengthens the case that the King List preserves genuine astronomical and chronological data, rather than mythological fabrication. The Hindu Puranas record the duration of the current cosmic age, the Kali Yuga, as 432,000 years, a figure that equals exactly 120 Sars, and appears in the Sumerian record as the total duration of the antediluvian period according to some versions of the King List. The Norse Eddas describe Valhalla as containing 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors would pass at Ragnarok. Producing a total of 432,000, the same figure expressed through an entirely different mythological vocabulary. The precision and cross-cultural consistency of this number, appearing in civilizations with no documented contact during the periods of their literary composition, points toward a common astronomical tradition of enormous antiquity from which all 3 cultures drew independently. A tradition that the Sumerian scribes who compiled the King List were not inventing but preserving. The 17 distinct building levels uncovered at Eridu during excavations conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 represent one of the most complete stratigraphic records of early Mesopotamian religious architecture ever recovered, and they present a problem that conventional archaeological models have not resolved in the 7 decades since their discovery. The deepest levels, dating to approximately 5000 BC, do not display the crude construction one would expect from the earliest phase of architectural development. They display the same fundamental proportional relationships, the same orientation principles, and the same hydraulic integration found in the most sophisticated temple complexes built 2000 years later, as though the builders of the first structure already possessed the complete architectural vocabulary that later generations merely refined. The lead excavators, Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, noted this anomaly in their original field reports, describing the earliest temple structures as exhibiting a degree of architectural maturity inconsistent with the surrounding material culture. A characterization that has received insufficient attention in subsequent scholarship. The earliest temple at Eridu, designated Temple Level 17 in the excavation sequence, and measuring approximately 3 meters by 3.5 meters in its original footprint, incorporates architectural features that only become significant when considered against the full developmental context. The walls are constructed from hand-formed mud bricks laid in a herringbone pattern that distribute structural loads more effectively than the simple stacked courses that appear in contemporaneous domestic architecture throughout southern Mesopotamia. The floor surface was treated with a hydraulic plaster compound that prevented moisture infiltration from the water table. Below, a detail that demonstrates not only technical knowledge of material properties, but foreknowledge of the site's hydrological conditions. Most significantly, the temple's orientation deviates from cardinal directions by precisely 11.5 degrees, an angular offset that corresponds to no obvious practical consideration, but that is maintained with remarkable consistency across all 17 building levels through more than 2,000 years of continuous construction and reconstruction on the same site. Architectural historian Robert Chitham, analysing the proportional systems employed across the Eridu sequence in a study published in the journal Iraq in 1983, identified a set of modular relationships governing the dimensions of successive temple structures that remain mathematically consistent from the earliest to the latest building phase, despite significant changes in absolute scale and construction technique. The basic module, which Chitham designated the Eridu unit and calculated as approximately 49.5 centimeters, appears in the dimensions of every structure in the sequence, from the 3-meter square earlier shrine to the elaborate multi-roomed complex of the latest phase. The persistence of this module across 2,000 years of architectural practice at a single site suggests it was understood not as a practical convenience, but as a sacred standard, a unit of measurement whose preservation was treated as an obligation rather than a choice. The hydraulic engineering incorporated into the temple complex from its earliest phase raises questions about the source of this technical knowledge that the conventional developmental model cannot answer. The site of Eridu sits at the southern end of the alluvial plain, where the water table is consistently high, and seasonal flooding presents a persistent threat to any permanent construction. The earliest builders chose this location deliberately, and they equipped their structures from the beginning with drainage channels, raised floor platforms, and waterproofing treatments that demonstrate comprehensive understanding of the site's hydrological challenges. This understanding requires either long prior experience at the same location, which the stratigraphy does not support, or the application of knowledge derived from experience elsewhere and brought to the site fully formed. The Abgallu texts, which locate the transmission of architectural and hydraulic knowledge to Eridu specifically, offer a historical framework for understanding this apparent contradiction in the developmental record. The consistency of the Eridu architectural tradition across 2,000 years also raises questions about the institutional mechanisms responsible for maintaining these standards. Modern architectural traditions are preserved through written specifications, professional training systems, and regulatory frameworks that ensure continuity across generational transitions. The Sumerians possessed writing by the later phases of the Eridu sequence, but the earliest building levels predate writing by more than a millennium. The preservation of precise proportional relationships and technical standards across such an extended period without written transmission implies either an extraordinarily robust oral and practical training tradition or the periodic reintroduction of standards from an external source with access to the original specifications. The cuneiform texts from later periods describe the maintenance of what they call the original plan of the House of the God, ancient architectural specifications that later builders were obligated to follow precisely, suggesting that the continuity evident in the archaeological record was not accidental but institutional, enforced by religious authority that understood its purpose to be preservation rather than development. The Sumerian deity Enki occupies a position in Mesopotamian cosmology that becomes significantly more interesting when his attributes are examined not as religious symbolism but as technical description. The texts consistently associate Enki with the Abzu, the freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the surface of the earth, with the establishment of irrigation systems, with the creation of humanity through biological manipulation, and with what the tablets describe as the House of Wisdom, a subterranean installation at Eridu where essential knowledge was stored and maintained. The Eridu Genesis, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, but clearly based on sources considerably older, describes this installation in language that corresponds less to mythological imagination than to architectural specification. The text provides measurements for underground chambers, describes environmental control systems that maintain stable conditions for stored materials, and lists categories of knowledge housed within the facility that span mathematics, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, and what the text calls the shaping arts, a term that appears in context suggesting advanced manufacturing processes rather than conventional handicrafts. The Sumerian hymn to Enki and the world order, preserved in one of the most complete versions of any early Sumerian literary text, and translated in detail by Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, in his 1956 study History Begins at Sumer, describes Enki performing a systematic survey of the known world and assigning divine supervisory responsibility for each domain of human activity to specific subordinate beings. The hymn is not organized as a narrative of divine beneficence. It is organized as an administrative document, listing responsibilities, designating supervisors, and specifying the technical parameters of each domain, with the kind of operational detail that characterizes institutional planning rather than religious poetry. Enki assigns one being to oversee the Tigris and Euphrates river systems with specific instructions about seasonal flow management. He assigns another to supervise the cultivation of grain with specifications about soil preparation and planting cycles. He assigns a third to maintain the fishing industries of the Persian Gulf with detailed knowledge of species behavior and harvest timing. The hymn reads, in critical respects, like a bureaucratic charter for the management of a complex agricultural civilization, not a hymn of praise to a nature deity. The physical evidence from Eridu supports the textual description of the Abzu installation as a genuine underground facility rather than a mythological construct. The excavations of Safar and Lloyd revealed, beneath the main temple complex, a series of subterranean chambers extending to depths that exceeded the requirements of any known ritual or storage function. These chambers, carved into the natural substrate rather than constructed from brick, incorporated drainage systems that connected to the site's overall hydraulic management infrastructure, and displayed wall treatments using bitumen and mineral compounds that created waterproof and chemically stable interior environments. The deepest accessible chambers contained residues of organic and mineral compounds that later chemical analysis identified as components of sophisticated preservation treatments, substances whose combination reflects knowledge of chemistry that was not supposed to be available to the cultures of 5th millennium Mesopotamia. The description of Enki as the Lord of the Abzu carries technical implications that extend beyond simple water management. The Abzu in Sumerian cosmology was not merely a body of water. It was understood as the source of all fresh water on Earth, the reservoir from which springs, rivers, and wells derived their supply through mechanisms that the Sumerians described in terms suggesting pressurized underground systems rather than the simple, gravitational flow of surface hydrology. Modern hydrogeology recognizes the existence of pressurized aquifer systems, confined groundwater formations that can produce artesian wells when tapped at appropriate points. As a real geological phenomenon whose principles the Sumerians appear to have understood in functional terms. The hydraulic engineering at Eridu, which successfully managed the water table at a site where it presented constant engineering challenges, reflects precisely the kind of practical understanding of subsurface hydrology that the Enki texts describe as divine knowledge transmitted to human engineers through the Abzu installation. The boundary between the theological and the technical in these texts is consistently less clear than conventional scholarship has assumed, and the physical evidence at the site the texts describe suggests that this ambiguity was not accidental. The Plimpton 322 tablet, housed in the collection of Columbia University and dating to approximately 1800 BC, represents one of the most studied mathematical documents in the ancient world, and its contents remain genuinely difficult to explain within conventional frameworks of Mesopotamian intellectual development. The tablet contains a structured table of numbers that modern mathematicians recognize as a systematic treatment of Pythagorean triples, relationships between the sides of right triangles that Greek tradition credits to Pythagoras in the 6th century BC, more than 1200 years after this Babylonian scribe recorded them with apparent routine familiarity. More troubling than the content itself is the evidence that Plimpton 322 was not a pioneering document but a teaching tool, suggesting the mathematical tradition it represents was already well established at the time of its composition. The tablet shows signs of having been handled extensively, its edges worn smooth through repeated consultation, and its format follows a standardized layout that appears in other mathematical tablets from the Old Babylonian period, indicating institutional familiarity with the type of calculation it presents, rather than the careful preservation one would expect for a novel intellectual achievement. The mathematical content of Plimpton 322 was first analysed in detail by Otto Neugebauer and Abraham Sachs in their 1945 study Mathematical Cuneiform Texts, and their analysis revealed that the table's 15 rows each represent a different Pythagorean triple. Sets of 3 integers satisfying the relationship that the square of the longest side equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. The triples on the tablet are not simple or obvious examples. Row 11 contains the values 45, 60 and 75, which reduce to the 345 triple familiar from basic geometry education. But row 1 contains the values 119, 120 and 169, a significantly more complex relationship that requires sophisticated methods of generation to discover. The systematic arrangement of these complex triples in a table, organized by decreasing values of one specific ratio, demonstrates that the tablet's author possessed not only knowledge of individual Pythagorean relationships, but a comprehensive theoretical understanding of the algebraic structure that generates all possible Pythagorean triples, a level of mathematical abstraction that ancient Greek mathematics did not achieve until several centuries after the supposed foundational work of Pythagoras himself. The implications extend beyond the specific content of Plimpton 322 when this tablet is examined in the context of the broader Old Babylonian mathematical tradition to which it belongs. Excavations at various Mesopotamian sites have recovered hundreds of mathematical tablets from the Old Babylonian period, spanning approximately 1900 to 1600 BC, that collectively demonstrate mastery of quadratic equations, cubic equations, systems of simultaneous equations, and techniques for numerical approximation that remained at the frontier of European mathematics until the 16th and 17th centuries AD. The Yale Babylonian collection holds tablet YBC 7289, which contains a calculation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places, achieved using an iterative approximation method that modern numerical analysis identifies as functionally equivalent to the Newton-Raphson method developed in 17th century Europe, the Columbia tablet, the Yale tablet, and their many counterparts from the Old Babylonian period were not products of a mathematical tradition in its early stages. They were products of a mature tradition that had already solved the foundational problems and moved on to systematic application. The question of where this mathematical tradition originated becomes more pressing when the archaeological record is examined for evidence of its development. If the sophisticated mathematics of the Old Babylonian period emerged through gradual accumulation from simpler beginnings, there should be a detectable sequence in the archaeological record, a progression from elementary arithmetic through increasingly complex operations to the advanced algebra and geometry visible in the surviving tablets. No such progression exists. The earliest mathematical tablets from Mesopotamia Recovered from Uruk phase contexts dating to approximately 3200 BC and representing the earliest writing of any kind recovered from anywhere in the world, already display the base 60 positional notation system and the organizational conventions that characterize Babylonian mathematics 1,000 years later. The tradition appears fully formed at its earliest documented expression. Just as the architectural tradition at Eridu appears fully formed at its earliest building level, and for precisely the same reason according to the cuneiform sources themselves. The Abgallu texts address the origins of mathematical knowledge directly. The tablet designating Enmeduga as one of the 7 sages credits him specifically with the transmission of mathematical principles to human scribal schools, describing his instruction in terms that encompass not only arithmetic calculation, but what the text calls the measuring of heaven and earth, a phrase that appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature, in context clearly referring to astronomical geometry and geodetic surveying. The Sumerian term for mathematics, era, literally means the path of going, a designation that suggests the Sumerians understood mathematical knowledge as navigational, rather than purely abstract. As a tool for moving through complex quantitative terrain rather than an end in itself. This functional orientation toward mathematics as applied science, rather than theoretical investigation, corresponds precisely with the character of the Babylonian mathematical tradition as revealed in the tablets, a tradition overwhelmingly focused on solving specific practical problems in astronomy, architecture, agriculture, and administration rather than on developing mathematical theory for its own sake. The knowledge the Abgallu transmitted was not the abstract mathematics of a philosophical tradition. It was the operational mathematics of an advanced civilization that had already solved the theoretical problems and distilled the results into practical tools for the management of complex systems. That distillation, encoded in clay tablets that a Babylonian schoolboy could handle and consult, represents one of the most significant and most poorly understood transmissions of knowledge in the entire human record. The astronomical compendium known as Mul.Apin, a 2-tablet series whose earliest surviving copies date to the 7th century BC, but whose observational content has been demonstrated through internal astronomical evidence to derive from observations made around 1200 BC or considerably earlier, represents the most comprehensive star catalogue produced by any ancient civilization, and contains elements that resist explanation through the gradual accumulation of naked-eye astronomical observation alone. The text divides the night sky into 3 pathways designated the Way of Anu, the Way of Enlil, and the Way of E, each encompassing specific stellar formations whose positions are recorded with mathematical precision that requires not only sophisticated observational instruments, but also a theoretical framework for celestial coordinate systems that was not supposed to exist in the ancient Near East. The organizational logic of Mul.Apin is not the logic of a document recording observations as they were made. It is the logic of a reference manual compiled from pre-existing databases, organized for practical use by astronomers who already understood the theoretical framework and required only the specific numerical values for operational application. The 3 pathways of Mul.Apin divide the celestial sphere according to declination bands that correspond to the annual paths of the Sun, Moon, and planets through different regions of the sky. The Way of Anu encompasses 18 stellar formations distributed along the celestial equator between approximately 17 degrees north and 17 degrees south declination. The Way of Enlil covers the northern celestial hemisphere above 17 degrees north, while the Way of E encompasses the southern regions below 17 degrees south. This tripartite division requires a coordinate system based on the celestial equator as a reference plane, a theoretical construct that modern astronomy inherited from ancient Greek spherical geometry and that conventional scholarship does not attribute to Mesopotamian astronomers before the Hellenistic period. Yet Mul.Apin employs this coordinate system with complete operational confidence, assigning specific formations to specific pathways and recording the intervals between stellar rising times with numerical precision that implies access to accurate angular measurement across the full celestial sphere. The stellar positions recorded in Mul.Apin present a more fundamental anomaly than the coordinate system alone. Astronomer Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem conducted a detailed analysis of the rising times recorded for individual stars in the text. comparing them against the actual stellar positions for various historical periods using modern computational astronomy, and published his findings in a 1994 study in the journal Archiv für Orientforschung. His analysis revealed systematic discrepancies between the recorded rising times and the positions that those stars would have occupied during any period of Mesopotamian civilization within the range of the text's proposed compositional dates. The discrepancies are not random observational errors. They are consistent offsets that match the expected positional shifts produced by precession across a specific time interval, suggesting that the observational data in Mul.Apin was collected during a period significantly earlier than the text's compilation, then incorporated without adjustment into the compiled reference work. Horowitz's calculations place the original observations at approximately 2200 to 2400 BC for the central body of stellar data, with certain sections showing positional values consistent with observations made as early as 3500 BC. The implications of this dating analysis extend beyond the question of Mul.Apin's composition history to the broader question of who made the original observations and with what instruments. Naked-eye astronomy, practiced with sufficient care and systematic recording over many generations, can produce accurate stellar catalogues, as demonstrated by the work of later Islamic and Chinese astronomers. But the accuracy of the positional data in Mul.Apin, combined with the theoretical sophistication of its organizational framework, suggests a level of institutional investment in astronomical observation that the archaeological record of early Mesopotamia does not easily accommodate. The ziggurat complexes of major Mesopotamian cities functioned in part as astronomical observation platforms, and the cuneiform administrative records from sites including Nippur and Babylon document the existence of specialist priest astronomers whose primary institutional responsibility was celestial observation and recording. But the accuracy achieved in Mul.Apin requires not merely systematic observation but calibrated measurement. The use of instruments capable of determining angular positions to within fractions of a degree across the full celestial sphere. No such instruments have been recovered from Mesopotamian archaeological contexts, though the texts describe what they call divine measuring rods and celestial observation chambers whose technical specifications remain tantalizing rather than conclusive. The star roads of Mul.Apin also contain references to stellar formations that do not correspond to any constellation visible from Mesopotamia during the historical period. The text describes the Star of the Wagon of Heaven as a 7-star formation, serving as a crucial navigation reference along the Way of Anu pathway. But the formation described does not match the northern circumpolar stars visible from Mesopotamia at any point in the precessional cycle. Computer modelling of stellar visibility from various points in the solar system, conducted by researchers working within the alternative astronomical tradition following the work of Zechariah Sitchin, has proposed that certain stellar configurations in Mul.Apin become coherent only when viewed from vantage points outside the Earth's surface, a suggestion that mainstream astronomy has not engaged with substantively, despite its potential significance for understanding the text's compositional history. What can be stated with confidence is that Mul.Apin preserves astronomical knowledge of a precision and theoretical sophistication that its attributed period of composition cannot fully explain, and that the text's organizational structure suggests derivation from sources both older and more technically capable than the Mesopotamian scribal tradition that produced the surviving copies. When British archaeologist Leonard Woolley completed his excavations at the ancient city of Ur between 1922 and 1934, the discovery that attracted international headlines was not the Royal Cemetery, with its extraordinary burial assemblages, though that discovery was remarkable enough. It was a layer of clean, water-deposited silt, approximately 2.5 meters thick, that separated the earliest cultural deposits from everything that came above it, a sterile interruption in the archaeological record that Woolley interpreted as physical confirmation of the biblical and Mesopotamian flood traditions. Subsequent excavations at Kish, Uruk-Lagash and Shuruppak identified similar flood deposits dating to a comparable period, and the consistency of these findings across the entire southern Mesopotamian plain raised questions about the scale and cause of the flooding event that conventional geological models have struggled to address adequately. Woolley himself, in his 1929 popular account Ur of the Chaldees, described standing at the edge of the clean silt layer and understanding for the first time that the flood traditions preserved in the Cuneiform tablets were not mythological inventions but historical memories, imperfect and embellished through centuries of oral transmission, but grounded in an actual catastrophic event whose physical evidence he was examining directly. The flood deposit at Ur presents characteristics that challenge the conventional explanation of enhanced riverine flooding caused by unusually heavy seasonal precipitation. The silt layer is remarkably uniform in particle size and composition, across its full depth of approximately 2.5 meters, a uniformity inconsistent with the layered deposition that results from flooding events of varying intensity over multiple seasons. Woolley's analysis of the deposit identified marine microfossils within the silt matrix, organisms whose presence indicated that the flooding water had included a significant component of seawater rather than purely fresh river water, a finding that implies inundation from a coastal or oceanic source rather than simple overflow of the Tigris and Euphrates. The geographic modelling required to produce marine flooding at Ur, located approximately 240 kilometres from the current Persian Gulf coastline, implies either a dramatically different coastline configuration at the time of the flood or an inundation event of sufficient energy to drive seawater hundreds of kilometres inland against the natural gradient of the river systems. The distribution of flood deposits across southern Mesopotamia provides additional constraints on the flood's character and cause. Max Mallowan, who participated in Woolley's excavations and later conducted his own investigations at Nineveh, noted in his analysis of Mesopotamian flood evidence published in the journal Iraq in 1964 that the flood layers at different sites, while broadly contemporaneous, show variations in deposit thickness and composition that are inconsistent with a single uniform flooding event, but consistent with multiple waves of inundation arriving from different directions at slightly different times. This wave pattern corresponds to what modern oceanographic modelling would predict from a major tsunami generated by an oceanic impact event, where successive wavefronts arrive at intervals determined by the geometry of the impact site and the bathymetry of the intervening water bodies. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which places a significant fragmented comet impact in the North Atlantic approximately 12,900 years ago, predicts precisely this kind of multi-directional wave pattern for coastal and near-coastal regions throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Though the precise dating relationship between the Younger Dryas event and the Mesopotamian flood deposits requires more detailed stratigraphic analysis than has yet been conducted. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved most completely in the Epic of Gilgamesh's 11th tablet recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, and first translated by George Smith of the British Museum in 1872, contains technical details about the flood's character and duration that align more closely with a tsunami event than with river flooding. Utnapishtim's account describes the flood as beginning not with gradual rise but with sudden catastrophic onset, a storm that darkened the sky instantly and produced waves of unprecedented height within the first hours. The text describes the sea rising to the height of the mountains, a statement that, taken literally rather than metaphorically, implies wave heights measured in hundreds of meters rather than the modest inundation of seasonal flooding. The duration of the flood, 7 days and 7 nights of initial catastrophe, followed by a prolonged period of elevated water levels, corresponds to the behavior of post-impact ocean systems, where initial wave damage is followed by weeks of disrupted circulation patterns and elevated sea levels before normal conditions are restored. These technical details, embedded in a narrative that has been dismissed as mythology for most of modern scholarship's engagement with it, describe a specific category of natural disaster with a precision that could only have been achieved through direct observation. The Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian around 1700 BC but preserving traditions that internal evidence suggests are substantially older, presents the creation of humanity not as a spiritual act of divine benevolence, but as a practical solution to a labour shortage, described with the kind of procedural specificity that distinguishes engineering documentation from religious narrative. The text explains that the lesser divine beings known as the Agigi had rebelled against the harsh conditions imposed by their superiors, forcing the Council of the Anunnaki to devise an alternative workforce. The solution, attributed to Enki working in collaboration with the birth goddess Ninmah, involved the preparation of 14 portions of clay 7 designated for male beings and 7 for female, each infused with what the text calls the divine essence of a slain deity named Wi'ila, whose blood provided the cognitive and longevity characteristics that would distinguish the new beings from ordinary animals. The specificity of these procedural details, the precise number of portions, the designation of sex, the identification of the genetic source material by name, represents a level of operational description that mythological narrative does not typically achieve or require. Creation myths generally explain outcomes. The Atrahasis epic explains processes, and the processes it describes are disturbingly recognizable in the vocabulary of modern molecular biology. The Akkadian term used in the Atrahasis text for the divine essence contributed by Wi'ila is temu, a word whose primary meaning in other cuneiform contexts is intelligence or reason, but which in this specific passage carries the additional connotation of inheritable characteristic, a quality that passes from parent to offspring through the reproductive process. The text specifies that Wi'ila was selected for sacrifice precisely because he possessed temu in exceptional measure, and that the purpose of incorporating his blood into the clay matrix was to ensure that the resulting beings would inherit this quality in a form that would persist through subsequent generations. This is not the language of spiritual endowment. It is the language of selective breeding, and the distinction the text draws between ordinary animals and the new beings created through this process is explicitly a distinction of cognitive capacity and lifespan rather than of spiritual status. The Atrahasis epic treats the creation of humanity as a biological engineering project, and it describes that project in terms that a modern geneticist would recognize as targeting specific heritable traits through the deliberate introduction of identified genetic material. The parallel text tradition in Sumerian, preserved in the tablet collection from Nippur and analysed in detail by Thorkild Jacobsen of Harvard University in his 1976 study The Treasures of Darkness, provides additional procedural details that the Akkadian Atrahasis version summarises without explaining fully. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis, fragmentary but supplementary to the Atrahasis tradition, describes a process of testing and refinement that preceded the creation of the final human model, in which earlier experimental beings were produced and evaluated against specific performance criteria before the successful template was established. These earlier beings are described in terms suggesting biological rather than mechanical failure, beings who were created successfully in a physical sense, but lacked the combination of cognitive capability and physical durability required for the intended application. The text describes 6 failed models before the successful 7th, a narrative structure that reflects the iterative character of experimental development rather than the decisive perfection of divine creation. The existence of failed prototypes in this tradition implies a process of genuine biological experimentation whose outcome was not predetermined, a detail that serves no mythological purpose but makes complete sense as a preserved memory of actual laboratory procedure. The Sumerian King List, a papyrus of extraordinary historical importance, discovered by Italian explorer Bernardino Drovetti in 1822 and now held in fragments at the Egyptian Museum in Turin, contains at its beginning a sequence of rulers that no conventional pharaonic history can accommodate. Before the first human dynasty, before Menes or Narmer, the papyrus records a series of divine kings whose reigns are measured in centuries and millennia, identified in the text as gods who ruled Egypt during a primordial period that the ancient Egyptians themselves called Zeptepi, meaning the first time. The historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC while serving as high priest at Heliopolis, and drawing from temple records of considerable antiquity, described these pre-dynastic rulers as beings who descended from the sky and established the fundamental institutions of Egyptian civilization before any human dynasty began. Manetho's account, preserved in fragments by later historians including Josephus, Africanus and Eusebius, assigns these divine rulers' reigns totaling more than 30,000 years before the first human pharaoh, a chronological claim that has been dismissed by Egyptology as mythological embellishment, despite its correspondence with the parallel tradition of antediluvian rulership preserved independently in Mesopotamian sources. The Palermo stone, a basalt stele dating to the 5th dynasty and representing one of the oldest royal annals in the world, begins its chronological record with a series of entries for pre-dynastic rulers whose names do not appear in any subsequently verified pharaonic list. These entries, occupying the damaged upper registers of the stone, record not only the names of these rulers, but administrative details about their reigns, including agricultural yields, construction projects, and ritual observances that are recorded with the same formulaic precision used for historical pharaohs in the document's lower, better preserved sections. The Palermo stone does not present these pre-dynastic figures as mythological beings. It presents them as administrative realities, rulers whose reigns generated the same categories of official record as those of Khufu or Thutmose III. The damage to the stone's upper registers has prevented full recovery of this pre-dynastic section, but what survives is sufficient to demonstrate that the scribes who composed the document understood the divine rulers of Zep Tepi as historical rather than mythological predecessors of the human pharaonic line. The Edfu building texts, carved into the walls of the Ptolemaic temple at Edfu in Upper Egypt, and representing one of the most extensive collections of ancient Egyptian cosmological and historical information in existence, provide the most detailed Egyptian account of the Zep Tepi period and its relationship to subsequent civilization. The texts, analysed comprehensively by Egyptologist Eve Raymond in her 1969 study The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, describe a primordial island of creation where the first divine beings established the foundations of Egyptian sacred architecture following a catastrophic flood that destroyed an earlier world. These beings, called the followers of Horus and the builder gods, are credited with creating detailed architectural plans that subsequent human builders were obligated to follow precisely, preserving the sacred proportional relationships established during the first time. The Edfu texts treat this architectural inheritance not as mythological inspiration, but as technical specification, providing measurements, orientation principles, and material requirements that the priests of the historical period maintained as religious obligations rather than creative choices. The precision with which historical Egyptian temples follow the proportional systems described in the Edfu texts, documented in detail by architectural historian John Anthony West in his 1993 study Serpent in the Sky, confirms that the divine architectural inheritance was a genuine technical tradition rather than a retrospective mythological claim. Among the most compelling categories of physical evidence for contact between early Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations is the remarkable consistency of iconographic traditions that appear simultaneously in both cultures during the late 4th millennium BC, a period when no direct trade routes connecting the two regions are documented in the conventional archaeological record. The cylinder seal known as the Temptation Seal, housed in the British Museum under catalogue number BM 29501, depicts a tree flanked by two seated figures with a serpent positioned behind one of them. A compositional arrangement that appears in virtually identical form on ivory knife handles from Gebel El Arak in Upper Egypt, dating to approximately 3300 BC, an object produced by craftsmen who, according to mainstream archaeology, had no mechanism for accessing Mesopotamian artistic conventions. The Gebel El Arak knife handle, now in the collection of the Louvre Museum in Paris, and designated object number E11517, also depicts on its other face a scene of naval combat between two distinct types of vessels, one clearly of Mesopotamian design with high prow and stern, and one of local Egyptian style. A scene whose specificity has led some scholars to propose direct maritime contact between the two civilizations during this period, despite the absence of supporting logistical evidence. The iconographic parallels extend well beyond this single object to encompass a pattern of shared symbolic vocabulary that appears across dozens of pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian artifacts. The Master of Animals motif, depicting a central human figure grasping two flanking beasts by the neck, appears in Mesopotamian cylinder seal art from the Uruk period beginning approximately 3500 BC, and appears simultaneously in Egyptian pre-dynastic art on objects including the Hierakonpolis painted tomb, dating to around 3400 BC, the hunter's pallet, and carved ivory handles from multiple elite burial contexts. The precision of the iconographic correspondence in these examples, including specific details of figure posture, animal placement, and compositional geometry, rules out independent parallel development and requires either direct cultural transmission or derivation from a common iconographic source, that influence both traditions simultaneously. The conventional explanation of Mesopotamian influence transmitted through trade contacts during the Naqada II period, proposed by archaeologist Helene Cantor in her 1944 study The Final Phase of Pre-Dynastic Culture, accounts for some of the parallels but cannot explain the simultaneity and completeness of the shared tradition, which appears in both cultures at full complexity rather than showing the gradual adoption pattern expected from external influence. The astronomical symbolism shared between early Mesopotamian and Egyptian iconographic traditions provides the most technically significant category of parallel evidence. Both cultures employ identical celestial symbolism for identical cosmological concepts during their earliest documented phases, including the association of specific stellar formations with divine authority, the use of the solar disk as a symbol of supreme governance, and the representation of the celestial pole as the fixed point around which divine order revolves. These conceptual parallels would be unremarkable if the two traditions were known to be in contact, but their appearance at the earliest documented phase of both civilizations, before the period of documented contact, suggests that both traditions inherited a shared symbolic vocabulary from a common predecessor whose own astronomical sophistication was sufficient to generate consistent iconographic conventions across geographically separated populations. The Abgallu texts of Eridu and the Zep Tepi traditions of Egypt, when read against this background of shared iconographic evidence, begin to describe not two independent civilizations receiving parallel divine instruction, but two regional expressions of a single much older tradition, whose origins lie in a period that neither the Mesopotamian nor the Egyptian archaeological record has yet been able to illuminate directly. The Aramaic fragments of the first book of Enoch recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran and dated by paleographic analysis to the 2nd century BC preserve what appears to be a substantially older oral tradition describing an encounter between humanity and 200 celestial beings who descended to the summit of Mount Hermon during the antediluvian period. The text is specific about the location, the number of beings involved, and the nature of the knowledge they transmitted to human populations, and it is specific in ways that correspond with unusual precision to Mesopotamian administrative records describing the Igigi, the lesser divine functionaries who served under the primary Anunnaki leadership, and whose rebellion against established authority is documented in the Atrahasis epic with matching narrative details. The correspondence between these two traditions, separated by geography, language, and religious framework, is not the vague thematic similarity that comparative mythology routinely identifies between unrelated cultures. It is a structural and numerical correspondence that implies derivation from a common historical source rather than independent mythological development. The Enochic tradition identifies the leader of the descending beings as Semjaza, a figure whose name derives from Aramaic roots meaning the name has seen, or he who sees the name, a designation that carries the same observational and supervisory connotations as the Sumerian and Akkadian terms used for the Igigi. The text lists 20 leaders beneath Semjaza, each responsible for a specific group of 10 subordinate beings, producing the total of 200 that matches the administrative records from Nippur describing exactly 200 Igigi assigned to earthly management functions under the primary Anunnaki hierarchy. This correspondence in numbers is not the kind of detail that emerges from independent mythological invention, where round numbers tend to dominate and administrative precision is generally absent. It reflects the preservation of an actual administrative record through two different cultural transmission chains that maintain the numerical accuracy despite transforming the conceptual framework around it. The knowledge attributed to the descending beings in the Enochic text covers precisely the same technical domains documented in the Mesopotamian Abgallu tradition. The Watcher Azazel, identified as the second in command after Semjaza, is credited in the first book of Enoch with teaching humanity the manufacture of weapons, the working of metals, the preparation of cosmetic compounds from mineral sources, and what the text describes as the secrets of the earth. A phrase that appears in contexts suggesting geological and mineralogical knowledge rather than esoteric spiritual information. The Watcher Barakel taught the observation of lightning and storm patterns. Kokabel instructed in the interpretation of stellar positions. Ezekiel taught the reading of cloud formations for weather prediction. Arakiel taught the observation of the earth. a designation that scholars including George W. E. Nicholsberg of the University of Iowa, in his 2001 commentary on First Enoch published by Fortress Press, have interpreted as referring to geodetic surveying or geomantic calculation. Each of these knowledge domains corresponds directly to a specific technical area attributed to one of the 7 Abgallu in the Sumerian tradition. A one-to-one correspondence across 2 independent textual traditions that is extraordinarily difficult to explain through parallel development. The geographical specificity of the Enochic account provides an additional layer of physical evidence that distinguishes this tradition from purely mythological narrative. Mount Hermon, the location identified in the first book of Enoch as the descent point, rises to 2,814 meters above sea level, on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, and occupies a position of extraordinary strategic significance in the ancient Near East. Controlling the primary overland routes between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast, and serving as a visible landmark from vast distances in multiple directions. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority between 1992 and 2003 documented extensive remains of ancient religious installations on and around the mountain, including stone circles, megalithic enclosures, and what appear to be the foundations of substantial permanent structures at multiple elevations. The summit installations, examined by a joint Israeli-French archaeological team in 2007, display construction techniques involving stones weighing in excess of 15 tons fitted together with precision joints inconsistent with the Neolithic or Bronze Age cultures conventionally associated with the region, suggesting construction by builders with access to more advanced engineering capabilities than any known local culture possessed. The punishment narrative in the first book of Enoch, which describes the Watchers being bound in the valleys of the earth and condemned to witness the destruction of their offspring before facing final judgment, corresponds with remarkable precision to the Mesopotamian tradition preserved in the Bit Messeri text, describing the banishment of certain Igigi following their violation of protocols governing human interaction. Both traditions agree on the nature of the violation, the unauthorized transmission of knowledge and the unauthorized biological mixing with human populations, and both agree on the nature of the punishment, confinement rather than destruction, implying that the beings involved were not destroyed but restrained, and that the knowledge they transmitted, though unauthorized, persisted in human populations. The Enochic account of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women described as giants, possessing both extraordinary physical capabilities and profoundly destructive behavior, parallels the Mesopotamian tradition of hybrid beings created through unauthorized genetic mixing that are described in the Sumerian text known as the Marriage of Martu as possessing characteristics of both divine and human heritage without the institutional integration that would allow them to function constructively in either society. These narrative correspondences across traditions separated by centuries of independent transmission carry the same evidentiary weight as the numerical and technical correspondences, pointing consistently toward a common historical event rather than a shared mythological invention. The archaeological site of Puma Punku, situated on the Bolivian Altiplano at an elevation of approximately 3,800 meters above sea level and associated with the Tiwanaku civilization, whose fluorescence is conventionally dated to between 500 and 1000 AD, contains stone construction of a quality and precision that has generated sustained controversy among both mainstream archaeologists and alternative researchers for reasons that neither camp has fully resolved. The andesite blocks that constitute the primary structural elements of the site, some weighing in excess of 130 tons, display surface finishing and joint tolerances that modern stonemasons working with contemporary equipment have assessed as achieving accuracy within fractions of a millimeter across spans of several meters, a standard of precision that the available tool technologies of any pre-Columbian civilization cannot plausibly explain. The standard archaeological explanation that Tiwanaku craftsmen achieved this precision through patient application of stone-on-stone grinding over extended periods has been tested experimentally by researchers including Jean-Pierre Protzen of the University of California, Berkeley, who demonstrated in studies published in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians in 1993 that while Andean stone grinding techniques can produce smooth surfaces, they cannot reliably maintain the geometric tolerances observed at Puma Punku across the complex interlocking joint configurations present in the actual blocks. The joint configurations at Puma Punku represent the most technically challenging aspect of the site's stonework, exceeding the surface finish in question in their implications for the sophistication of the engineering involved. The blocks display H-shaped cross-sections, dovetail connections, tongue and groove assemblies, and precisely dimensioned rectangular cutouts that interlock with corresponding features on adjacent blocks to create a structural system that requires no binding mortar, because the geometric interlocking itself provides the structural stability. Each of these joint types requires not only precise cutting of the joint profile, but precise matching of the corresponding negative profile on the mating block, a requirement that doubles the precision demanded of each individual operation. The H-shaped blocks at Puma Punku, some of which weigh over 8 tons, have been measured by architectural engineers including Alexei Vranich of the University of California, Berkeley, in his 2006 analysis of the site, and found to maintain dimensional consistency across multiple examples to within 2 mm, suggesting the use of standardized templates or precision measurement tools capable of maintaining this tolerance across the full range of block dimensions. The source geology of the Puma Punku blocks provides an additional layer of engineering challenge that the conventional explanation struggles to accommodate. The andesite used for the precision-fitted structural elements was quarried from the Copacabana Peninsula approximately 90 kilometers from the site, across Lake Titicaca, requiring transportation of blocks weighing up to 130 tons across a major body of water and then overland to the construction site at an altitude where human physical performance is significantly reduced by oxygen deprivation. The red sandstone used for other elements at the site was quarried approximately 10 kilometers away, a more manageable distance but still requiring the movement of blocks weighing up to 131 tons across terrain that offers no natural transport advantages. The engineering calculations required to plan and execute these transport operations, accounting for load distribution, flotation if water transport was used, gradient management and final positioning precision, represent a level of logistical sophistication that the conventional attribution of Puma Punku's construction to pre-Columbian Andean cultures has never adequately addressed. The drill holes found throughout the Puma Punku complex provide perhaps the most technically specific evidence for advanced manufacturing capabilities at the site. Researchers including Brian Forster, who conducted microscopic analysis of the drill hole surfaces in 2012, documented characteristics including perfectly circular cross-sections maintained to depths of several centimeters, parallel side walls with no measurable taper, and spiral tool marks consistent with rotary drilling rather than percussion techniques. The diameter consistency across multiple holes of the same nominal size achieves tolerances of less than 0.5 millimeter, a standard that requires precision boring equipment capable of maintaining dimensional accuracy throughout the full depth of the cut. No rotary drilling tools from any pre-Columbian context have been recovered in the archaeological record of the Andes, and experimental attempts to replicate the Puma Punku drill holes using period-appropriate tools and techniques have consistently failed to achieve the documented precision. The physical evidence at the site, examined on its own terms rather than through the filter of what pre-Columbian cultures are assumed to have been capable of, describes a level of manufacturing technology that has no equivalent in the conventional archaeological record of the Americas before European contact. The stratigraphic boundary layer deposited approximately 12,900 years ago, now documented at over 50 archaeological and geological sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, contains a constellation of markers that a growing body of researchers interprets as evidence for a major extraterrestrial impact event of sufficient magnitude to trigger the rapid climate deterioration known as the Younger Dryas period. The evidence includes nanodiamonds found exclusively in impact environments, a platinum anomaly consistent with extraterrestrial metal deposition, cosmic spherules produced by temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, and iridium concentrations that mirror the geochemical signatures of confirmed impact sites. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first formally proposed by a research team led by Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in 2007 and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, offers the first coherent physical mechanism for the global catastrophe preserved in the flood traditions of more than 500 independent cultures, and its implications for understanding the destruction of any advanced civilization that may have existed before 12,900 years ago are profound and largely unexplored by mainstream archaeology. The platinum anomaly, which provides perhaps the most chemically unambiguous evidence for the impact hypothesis, was documented in Greenland ice cores by a research team led by Mikhail Petaev of Harvard University in a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013. The team identified a sharp spike in platinum concentration at the ice layer corresponding to 12,800 years ago. A spike representing platinum concentrations approximately 100 times the background level for the surrounding strata. Platinum is vanishingly rare in Earth's crustal rocks, comprising approximately 5 parts per trillion by mass in average continental crust, but is significantly more abundant in certain classes of meteoritic and cometary material. The magnitude and sharpness of the platinum spike at the Younger Dryas boundary, combined with its appearance in ice core records from both Greenland and Antarctica, demonstrates simultaneous global atmospheric deposition of platinum-rich material from a single event, a distribution pattern that can only be produced by an extraterrestrial impact or airburst of sufficient energy to distribute cometary or meteoritic material throughout the global atmosphere. The carbon spherules and magnetic spherules recovered from the Younger Dryas boundary layer at sites across 4 continents provide complementary evidence for impact-generated incineration of surface vegetation and soils at continental scale. James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, a leading advocate of the impact hypothesis whose research has been published in journals including Science, Earth Science Reviews, and the Journal of Geology, has documented carbon spheral concentrations at the Younger Dryas boundary that represent orders of magnitude increases over background levels, consistent with the generation of continental-scale wildfires by the thermal pulse and ejected distribution of a major impact event. The isotopic signatures of carbon within these spherules, analysed using mass spectrometry techniques, show characteristics consistent with exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, temperatures that wildfire alone cannot generate, but that impact-driven firestorms readily produce. The geographic distribution of the spheral concentrations, highest in North America and decreasing systematically toward Europe and the Middle East, is consistent with an impact centre in the North American or North Atlantic region, matching the distribution pattern predicted by the fragmented comet impact model proposed by Firestone's original team. The biological consequences of the Younger Dryas impact event, documented in the paleontological record across multiple continents, establish the magnitude of the catastrophe with an independent line of evidence that reinforces the physical and chemical impact markers. The late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction event, which eliminated approximately 75% of large mammal genera in North America and significant proportions on other continents within a narrow time window, bracketing 12,900 years ago, represents one of the most rapid mass extinction events in the geological record outside of the 5 major extinction boundaries. The woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat, the American horse, and dozens of other large mammal species disappeared from the fossil record within this window. And the synchronicity of their extinction across species with very different ecological requirements and geographic distributions argues against gradual climatic change or human hunting pressure as the primary cause. Paul Martin of the University of Arizona, who developed the overkill hypothesis attributing Pleistocene megafaunal extinction to human hunters, acknowledged in his later work that the rapidity and geographic comprehensiveness of the extinctions exceeded what hunting pressure alone could produce. Leaving the impact hypothesis as the most complete available explanation for a catastrophe, whose severity the archaeological and paleontological record documents with increasing clarity. The comparative analysis of flood narratives conducted by biblical scholar Richard Andre in the 19th century, and substantially expanded by more recent researchers, including Alan Dundes and David Talbot, has documented more than 500 independent cultural traditions describing a catastrophic global inundation, a number that itself constitutes an evidentiary anomaly demanding explanation. What makes this distribution truly remarkable is not the prevalence of flood stories but their specific technical consistency across populations that could not have been in contact during the periods when these traditions were formed. The Hopi tradition of the American Southwest specifies a flood duration of 150 days, matching exactly the figure given in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. The Cherokee tradition describes survival vessels sealed with pine pitch, corresponding to the bitumen sealing described in the cuneiform flood accounts. The Maasai of East Africa describes survival by constructing a vessel from acacia wood, a material choice that reflects the same practical knowledge of timber durability found in Near Eastern shipbuilding traditions. The convergence of these specific technical details across cultures separated by oceans and millennia cannot be explained by mythological invention, cultural diffusion, or Jungian archetypes. It demands a common historical experience of sufficient magnitude and sufficient recency that accurate technical details survive the transmission process intact. The structural analysis of flood narratives conducted by folklorist Stith Thompson, whose motif index of folk literature remains the standard reference for comparative mythological analysis, identified 37 specific narrative elements that appear with significant frequency across the global flood tradition. Among these, the most diagnostically significant are the elements that carry technical rather than dramatic information, details whose preservation serves no narrative purpose, but whose accuracy suggests derivation from eyewitness accounts. The specification of the flood's duration, which appears in traditions from Mesopotamia, North America, Australia, and Polynesia as periods ranging from 7 days to 150 days with intermediate values also documented, reflects genuine variation in local experience of a single global event rather than independent mythological invention, in the same way that witnesses to a single historical event may report different durations depending on their distance from the event's centre. The specification of the flood's onset as sudden and catastrophic, appearing in virtually all traditions regardless of geographic origin, corresponds to the tsunami signature identified in the Mesopotamian flood deposits and predicted by the younger Dryas impact model, distinguishing this event from the gradual seasonal flooding that most ancient agricultural societies experienced routinely. The Australian Aboriginal flood traditions deserve particular attention in this analysis because they represent some of the longest continuous oral traditions in human history, and because their geographic isolation from the ancient Near East makes any hypothesis of cultural diffusion from Mesopotamian sources implausible for traditions documented before European contact. The Bundjalung people of southeastern Australia preserve accounts of the Great Flood of Ngurunderi that describe the waters rising for 7 days before reaching their maximum level, a duration specification that appears in Mesopotamian sources but that the Bundjalung had no mechanism for inheriting from them. The traditions of the Worimi people of New South Wales describe the flood as accompanied by a great fire in the sky, a detail that corresponds to the airburst or impact fireball predicted by the younger Dryas impact model, but that has no parallel in Mesopotamian flood narrative, suggesting it preserves a regional observation of the impact event itself rather than a borrowed narrative element. The consistency of the flood's essential character across Aboriginal traditions from different parts of Australia, combined with the presence of region-specific details that differ from Near Eastern accounts while sharing their core technical features, demonstrates that these traditions preserve independent memories of the same physical event rather than borrowed mythology. The flood traditions of the Pacific Island cultures provide a further independent confirmation of global catastrophic flooding through their documentation of the event from a maritime perspective that differs fundamentally from the terrestrial viewpoint of Near Eastern and Australian accounts. Polynesian traditions consistently describe the flood as a raising of the ocean floor rather than a falling of rain, a description that corresponds precisely to the mechanism of tsunami generation by an oceanic impact, where the energy of the impact raises the ocean surface above its normal level across vast areas simultaneously. The Tahitian account recorded by missionary William Ellis in his 1829 study Polynesian Researches describes the god Taiaroa causing the sea to rise by agitating its foundation, language that describes vertical displacement of the ocean floor rather than overflow from precipitation, and specifies that the waters covered all land except the highest peaks before gradually receding. The mathematical precision of this description, combined with its mechanistic specificity, that identifies the correct physical mechanism for a tsunami while being recorded from a culture with no exposure to modern oceanographic science, preserves either remarkable intuitive understanding or genuine eyewitness tradition of sufficient accuracy to correctly identify the cause of the event it describes. When sponge divers exploring a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901 recovered a corroded bronze object approximately the size of a shoebox, they could not have anticipated that it would spend the next century gradually revealing itself to be the most technologically sophisticated artifact ever recovered from the ancient world. The Antikythera mechanism, now housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, consists of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears of extraordinary precision arranged to function as an analog astronomical computer capable of calculating the positions of celestial bodies, predicting lunar and solar eclipses according to the 18-year Saros cycle, and tracking the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, all simultaneously. The gear train includes a differential mechanism, a mechanical principle that historians of technology previously attributed to 16th century European clockmakers, creating a documented gap of more than 1,500 years between the device's construction and the supposed reinvention of the technology it employed. The Antikythera mechanism does not merely demonstrate that ancient Greeks possessed sophisticated mechanical knowledge. It demonstrates that the conventional model of technological development as a continuous linear progression from simple to complex is fundamentally wrong. Because no linear model can account for the appearance of a technology 15 centuries before the earliest point at which that technology is supposed to have been possible, the internal structure of the Antikythera mechanism, revealed through X-ray tomography by a team led by Tony Freeth of the Antikythera research team in studies published in Nature in 2006 and subsequently expanded through detailed CT scanning by a collaboration between University College London and the National Archaeological Museum published in Scientific Reports in 2021, has exposed a gear system of extraordinary computational sophistication whose full capabilities are still being decoded more than a century after the device's discovery. The main drive gear contains 223 teeth corresponding to the Saros cycle of 223 lunar months used for eclipse prediction, while a subsidiary gear train of 5 gears tracks the anomalistic month, the period between successive lunar perigees, with sufficient accuracy to predict the variable speed of the moon's apparent motion across the sky. This lunar anomaly calculation requires what modern mathematicians recognize as a pin-and-slot mechanism that converts uniform circular motion into variable circular motion according to a specific mathematical function, a technique whose mathematical foundation involves the approximation of trigonometric relationships that ancient Greek mathematics is not supposed to have possessed in computational form. The inscriptions preserved on the mechanism's fragments, partially deciphered through multispectral imaging techniques applied by the Antikythera research team, provide operational instructions and astronomical commentary that shed additional light on the device's intended use and intellectual context. The inscriptions reference the Metonic cycle of 19 years, the Calippic cycle of 76 years, and the Exeligmos cycle of 54 years as organizational frameworks for the eclipse prediction system, demonstrating that the device's designers possessed comprehensive knowledge of the nested astronomical cycles required for long-range celestial prediction. The fragments also contain references to planetary motions, and reconstruction work by physicist Tony Freeth and astronomer Alexander Jones of New York University, published in Scientific Reports in 2017, proposed that the original complete mechanism included gear trains for tracking the positions of all 5 planets known to ancient Greek astronomy, a capability that would require additional gear complexity, whose physical evidence has been lost to the deterioration of the surviving fragments, but whose mathematical framework the inscriptions partially preserve. The manufacturing precision demonstrated in the Antikythera mechanism's surviving gear work provides direct evidence of the technological infrastructure required for its production. The gear teeth, examined under electron microscopy by researchers, including Michael Wright of the Imperial College London in studies published between 2002 and 2007, show machining characteristics inconsistent with hand filing or casting. The tooth profiles maintain consistent involute curves across their full surfaces, a geometric form that transmits rotational motion with minimal friction and backlash, and that requires precise template-controlled cutting rather than freehand fabrication. The bronze alloy composition of the gears, analysed by X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, shows a copper-tin ratio optimised for hardness and wear resistance that matches the specifications that a modern metallurgist would select for precision gear manufacture, demonstrating that the device's creators possessed empirical knowledge of metallurgical optimization that modern engineering has derived through systematic scientific study. The Antikythera mechanism does not represent an isolated genius. It represents the visible product of a sophisticated technological tradition that must have included precision metalworking, advanced astronomical theory, and mechanical engineering capabilities far exceeding anything else documented from the ancient Mediterranean world, a tradition whose origins and institutional basis remain entirely unexplained by the conventional history of ancient technology. Among the artifacts recovered from archaeological contexts in Mesopotamia during the 1930s, a series of ceramic vessels discovered at Kujut Rabu near Baghdad attracted the attention of Wilhelm König, director of the Iraq Museum, who recognized in their construction a configuration that closely replicates the functional architecture of a galvanic cell. The Baghdad batteries, as they came to be known, consist of clay jars approximately 14 centimeters tall, containing copper cylinders sealed at the bottom with asphalt plugs, each fitted with an iron rod suspended concentrically within the copper tube and insulated from direct contact. When filled with an acidic electrolyte solution, these assemblies generate approximately 1.1 volts of electrical potential. An analysis of metal artifacts recovered from sites in close association with the battery jars has revealed evidence of electroplating, uniform metallic coatings consistent with electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical application. König published his initial analysis in a 1940 study titled Im Verlorenen Paradies, presenting his interpretation that the vessels functioned as electrochemical cells, and while mainstream scholarship has generally preferred explanations involving ritual use or scroll storage, no alternative explanation has successfully accounted for all of the physical characteristics that make the galvanic cell interpretation compelling. The construction details of the Baghdad battery vessels reveal a level of functional precision that distinguishes them from objects designed for storage or ritual purposes. The copper cylinders were formed from sheet copper, rolled into tubes and soldered along their seams, a manufacturing technique that produces a more dimensionally consistent and electrically conductive component than cast or hammered alternatives. The iron rods were suspended within the copper cylinders using asphalt plugs that provided both mechanical support and electrical insulation, preventing direct contact between the dissimilar metals that would short-circuit the electrochemical reaction. The dimensional relationship between the iron rod diameter and the copper cylinder diameter creates an annular gap that maximizes the electrode surface area available for electrochemical reaction, while maintaining the structural integrity of the assembly, a configuration that a modern electrochemist designing a simple galvanic cell would arrive at through the same functional reasoning. The vessels themselves are sealed in a manner inconsistent with their use as storage containers, because the sealing would prevent access to any stored contents, but entirely consistent with their use as sealed electrochemical cells designed to maintain a stable electrolyte environment over extended periods. The electroplating evidence recovered from sites associated with the Baghdad battery tradition provides the most significant functional confirmation of König's interpretation. Wilfried Mengin, in his analysis of metal artifacts from Mesopotamian sites published in the journal Berliner Beiträge zur Vor- und Frühgeschichte in 1983, documented a series of copper and silver objects displaying thin metallic coatings of unusual uniformity, whose adhesion characteristics and thickness distribution were inconsistent with fire gilding, mercury amalgam application, or mechanical overlay techniques used in known ancient metalworking. The coatings examined by Menghin showed thickness uniformity across complex curved surfaces that modern electroplating engineers recognize as characteristic of electrochemical deposition, where the electric field geometry in the electrolyte solution distributes metal ions across the workpiece surface more uniformly than any mechanical application method can achieve. The specific artifacts examined included copper vessels with silver coatings and bronze objects with gold surface treatments whose chemical composition and microstructural characteristics matched the results of experimental electroplating conducted by American electrical engineer Arne Egebrecht. who demonstrated in experiments conducted at the Roma Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim in 1978 that Baghdad battery replicas could produce gold-plated surfaces on copper objects indistinguishable from the ancient artifacts under microscopic examination. The broader context of electrical knowledge in the ancient world extends beyond the Baghdad battery to encompass a range of phenomena documented in ancient texts that acquire new significance when read against the background of functional electrochemistry. The Dendera reliefs in Egypt, carved in the Ptolemaic temple complex and depicting what appear to be large glass vessels containing serpentine filaments supported on insulating columns, have been interpreted by electrical engineer Walter Gahn in a study published in 1978 as representations of arc discharge devices, early prototypes of the principle underlying modern gas discharge tubes. The interpretation remains controversial, but the dimensional relationships in the carved reliefs, analysed by Gahn using standard electrical engineering scaling principles, produce tube dimensions that fall within the range required for stable arc discharge at the voltage levels achievable by multiple Baghdad battery cells connected in series. The possibility that ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian craftsmen possessed not only the galvanic cell but also the knowledge to connect multiple cells and apply the resulting higher voltages to gas discharge applications would represent a level of practical electrical knowledge whose institutional origins and transmission history remain entirely uncharted by conventional history of science. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of the celestial pole to trace a complete circle against the background stars over a period of approximately 25,920 years, requires a minimum of several centuries of careful astronomical observation to detect and several centuries more to calculate with any precision. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is conventionally credited with its discovery around 127 BC, making the appearance of accurate precessional calculations in sources predating him by thousands of years one of the most difficult anomalies in the history of ancient science. Yet the Sumerian base 60 numerical system encodes the precessional cycle with unmistakable precision, the number 432,000 representing exactly 200 complete precessional cycles when multiplied by 60, and this same number appears with striking regularity in Hindu, Norse and Babylonian cosmological texts that have no documented connection to one another beyond their apparent access to the same astronomical tradition. The work of Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von der Schend, presented in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, published by Gambit Press, first systematically demonstrated the pervasiveness of precessional encoding in world mythology, and while their analysis has been criticised on methodological grounds, no subsequent scholarship has successfully refuted their central finding that ancient mythological systems across multiple independent cultures preserve accurate precessional calculations in numerical and narrative form. The mathematical precision of the precessional encoding in Sumerian sources is most clearly demonstrated through the structural analysis of the cosmological number system that underlies Mesopotamian religious and astronomical texts. The Sumerians designated the number 3. 1,600 as one say, the highest named number in their system and the fundamental unit of the longest time periods recorded in the King List. The number 7,202 sars corresponds to 1/3 of a precessional degree, the smallest unit of precessional motion that has practical significance for astronomical observation. The number 25,920, the full precessional period in years, equals exactly 7.2 sars, a relationship that demonstrates the SAR unit was designed with the precessional cycle as its reference point, rather than emerging independently and coincidentally relating to precessional periods. The number 432,000, which appears in Mesopotamian sources as the total duration of the antediluvian period, the number of years in the Hindu Kali Yuga, and the number of warriors in the Norse Valhalla calculated from the Edic description, equals exactly 120 sars and corresponds to 200 complete precessional cycles, a relationship so precise and so consistently encoded across multiple, unrelated textual traditions that de Santillana and von der Schend interpreted it as the signature number of a global astronomical tradition of enormous antiquity. The Hindu Yuga system provides the most mathematically elaborate expression of precessional knowledge outside the Mesopotamian tradition, and its independence from Mesopotamian sources makes the numerical correspondence between the two systems all the more significant as evidence for a common astronomical heritage. The four Hindu yugas span total periods of 1,728,000 years for the Satya Yuga, 1,296,000 years for the Treta Yuga, 864,000 years for the Dvapara Yuga, and 432,000 years for the Kali Yuga, producing a total Mahayuga of 4,320,000 years. These figures maintain the ratio 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 across the four ages, a harmonic proportion system that encodes the same mathematical relationships governing musical intervals. A connection that the ancient astronomical traditions consistently drew between celestial mechanics and acoustic harmony. Each individual Yuga period is a precise multiple of 432,000, the same fundamental precessional constant that appears in Mesopotamian and Norse sources, demonstrating that Hindu cosmological chronology was constructed using the precessional cycle as its basic unit of cosmic time measurement, a fact that requires either extraordinary coincidence or derivation from the same astronomical tradition that generated the Mesopotamian and Norse numerical systems. The Norse expression of precessional knowledge through the Valhalla imagery of the Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century AD but drawing from oral traditions of substantially greater antiquity, demonstrates the persistence of precessional encoding through cultural frameworks that have undergone dramatic transformations in religious and social organization. The Edda states that Valhalla contains 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors will march at Ragnarok, producing a total of 432,000 warriors. The precessional constant expressed through military imagery that carries no obvious astronomical significance to readers unfamiliar with the underlying numerical tradition. This encoding strategy, burying a precise astronomical constant within a vivid narrative image that ensures its memorization and transmission, without requiring the transmitters to understand its mathematical significance, represents exactly the kind of long-term knowledge preservation technique that a sophisticated culture, anticipating periods of civilizational regression, would design for ensuring that critical information survived intact through dark ages during which its technical meaning might be forgotten, but its narrative vehicle would continue to be transmitted. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu in the 26th century BC, according to conventional Egyptology, encodes within its fundamental dimensions a series of mathematical and astronomical relationships whose precision is sufficiently remarkable to have generated sustained scholarly debate about whether they could represent intentional design or coincidental approximation. The pyramid's base perimeter divided by twice its height yields the mathematical constant pi to 4 decimal places, a relationship that requires not only knowledge of pi but the intention to express it architecturally at a scale involving millions of precisely cut limestone blocks. More significantly, when the pyramid's base perimeter is multiplied by 43,200, the result equals the polar circumference of the Earth to within a fraction of a percent, with 43,200 representing precisely 1/600th of the precessional cycle in years, a connection so precise and so multi-layered that the probability of its accidental emergence approaches statistical impossibility. The surveying precision required to encode these relationships in a structure covering approximately 5.5 hectares of ground surface represents an engineering achievement that demands explanation, regardless of one's position, on the question of intentional astronomical encoding. Because the tolerances required for the encoding to be detectable are the same tolerances demonstrated in the physical construction of the monument itself. The surveying precision of the Great Pyramid's base has been measured by multiple independent investigators using increasingly sophisticated instruments, and the results consistently reveal accuracy that challenges explanation through the surveying technologies conventionally attributed to 4th Dynasty Egypt. Flinders Petrie's foundational survey conducted between 1880 and 1882, published in his 1883 monograph The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, established that the 4 base sides of the Great Pyramid vary in length by a maximum of only 4.4 centimeters across an average side length of 230.3 meters, representing a proportional variation of approximately 1 part in 5,000. The four corners deviate from true right angles by a maximum of 12 arcseconds, a precision equivalent to what modern theodolite surveying achieves with careful technique and good conditions. Petrie's survey was conducted using 19th century instruments, and his measurements have been substantially confirmed by subsequent surveys using modern, laser-ranging equipment, including the survey conducted by Glenn Dash of the Glenn Dash Research Foundation and Mark Lehner of Ancient Egypt Research Associates in 2015, which found the base orientation accurate to within 3.4 arc-minutes of true north, a level of directional precision that requires either extremely refined astronomical observation methods or access to surveying knowledge more sophisticated than the conventional Egyptological account attributes to the Fourth Dynasty. The internal architecture of the Great Pyramid encodes astronomical relationships that extend the mathematical sophistication of its external dimensions into three-dimensional space. The ascending passage leading to the King's Chamber is inclined at an angle of 26 degrees and 18 arc-minutes, a slope that Robert Boval of the Antikythera research group demonstrated in his 1994 book The Orion Mystery, points directly at the lower culmination of the star Thuban, which served as the North Pole star at the time the pyramid was conventionally dated to have been built. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber is inclined at 45 degrees and approximately 14 arc-minutes, pointing toward the belt stars of Orion at their upper culmination around 2500 BC, while the northern shaft at 32 degrees and approximately 28 arc-minutes pointed toward the circumpolar stars of the Draco constellation at the same epoch. The precision of these alignments, which must account for the refraction of starlight through the Earth's atmosphere at the specific elevation angles involved, demonstrates that the pyramid's internal architecture was designed by individuals who possessed both the theoretical astronomical knowledge to calculate these alignments and the practical engineering capability to implement them within a tolerance of less than 1 degree across shaft lengths of more than 60 meters through solid limestone masonry. The systematic archaeological investigation of continental shelf regions submerged by rising sea levels following the end of the last ice age has produced discoveries that collectively constitute one of the most significant archaeological frontiers of the 21st century and one of the most consistently underreported. At the peak of the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels stood between 100 and 140 meters lower than their current position, exposing vast areas of continental shelf that would have represented highly attractive environments for human settlement. The flooding of these regions as ice sheets collapsed between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago would have progressively destroyed any archaeological evidence of civilizations that had developed in coastal and lowland environments, creating an enormous blind spot in the human record that conventional archaeology has been structurally unable to address. The implications of this blind spot for the search for advanced prehistoric civilizations are fundamental, because the environments most attractive for early urban development, coastal plains with access to marine resources, freshwater rivers, and fertile alluvial soils, are precisely the environments that were submerged by post-glacial sea level rise. Removing their archaeological evidence from the accessible record entirely, the submerged ruins off the coast of Dwarka in the Gulf of Kambat, investigated by the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India in surveys conducted between 1999 and 2002, represent perhaps the most extensively documented example of underwater archaeological evidence for prehistorical urban civilization. Side-scan sonar surveys of the Gulf floor at depths between 9 and 40 meters revealed geometric patterns of rectilinear structures extending over an area of several square kilometers, including what appear to be walls, platforms, and what the survey team led by S.R. Rao interpreted as harbour installations. Dredging operations within the survey area recovered artefacts including ceramic fragments, worked stone objects, and what appeared to be structural elements that were submitted for dating analysis. The results, published in the Journal of the Geological Society of India in 2002, produced carbon-14 dates for organic materials associated with the dredged artefacts ranging from 7,500 to 9,500 years before the present, dates that place the construction of these structures before the conventional beginning of urban civilization anywhere in the world, and that correspond to the period of rapid sea level rise that would have submerged a coastal settlement in this location as the post-glacial transgression advanced northward into the Gulf of Kambat. the Mahabharata's description of Dwarka, Krishna's capital city described as built on land reclaimed from the sea and eventually submerged when the ocean reclaimed its territory, following Krishna's death, corresponds with the underwater survey findings in ways that suggest the epic preserves genuine historical memory of this specific coastal site rather than purely mythological narrative. The text describes a city of extraordinary architectural sophistication with planned streets, multiple harbour facilities, and monumental buildings constructed from materials transported from distant sources, characteristics consistent with the sonar imagery recovered from the Gulf of Kambat surveys. The Mahabharata specifies that the submersion of Dwarka occurred gradually over a period of days, following a celestial event described as a change in the stars, a detail that corresponds to the mechanism of post-glacial sea level rise, in which coastal areas were progressively inundated as global ice volumes declined, rather than the sudden catastrophic flooding that the text might have been expected to describe for dramatic effect. This preference for gradual mechanism over dramatic narrative in a text otherwise characterized by cosmic drama suggests that the submersion account preserves genuine observational memory of an actual gradual geological process rather than mythological invention. The underwater structure discovered by dive instructor Kiichiro Aratake, approximately 500 meters off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan, during 1986 has generated more sustained controversy per square meter of stone than perhaps any archaeological site on Earth, with mainstream geologists arguing for natural formation and alternative researchers presenting evidence of deliberate construction that has never been satisfactorily refuted. The Yonaguni monument extends over an area of approximately 60 by 50 meters and reaches a maximum depth of 25 meters below current sea level, consisting of a series of stepped platforms, vertical walls, right-angle corners, parallel surfaces, and what appear to be carved channels and ceremonial pools arranged in configurations whose geometric regularity would be extraordinary if produced by natural geological processes operating on the ignimbrite and mudstone formations that constitute the structure. The debate between natural and artificial formation hypotheses has been conducted primarily through site examination reports, rather than rigorous experimental testing of the specific formation mechanisms proposed by each side, leaving the question formally unresolved despite decades of investigation, a situation that reflects less the inherent ambiguity of the evidence than the institutional reluctance of mainstream archaeology to engage seriously with sites whose implications challenge conventional timelines. The geological arguments for natural formation of the Yonaguni monument centre on the observation that the mudstone and sandstone formations of which it is composed exhibit natural jointing patterns that can produce planar surfaces, angular intersections, and step-like profiles through differential erosion along bedding planes and vertical fracture systems. Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, who has conducted more systematic underwater investigation of the site than any other researcher, published a detailed response to the natural formation hypothesis in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology in 2007, presenting evidence for specific features that he argued could not have been produced by natural jointing and erosion. Among the features cited by Kimura were a series of rectangular cutouts in the main terrace platform, whose dimensions follow a consistent modular relationship, suggesting they were produced using a standard measurement unit, rather than by random fracture propagation. Kimura also documented what he interpreted as a drainage channel carved into the upper surface of the main terrace, running along a curving path that deflects around obstacles and maintains a consistent gradient toward the platform edge, a configuration that he argued demonstrates intentional hydraulic engineering rather than natural erosion, because natural erosion produces channels that follow the steepest descent gradient rather than deflecting around structural features. The astronomical alignments of the Yonaguni monument, analysed by archaeoastronomer Nobuhiro Yoshida of the Japan Petrograph Society, provide an additional category of evidence whose significance has not been adequately addressed by proponents of the natural formation hypothesis. Yoshida's analysis, presented at the International Symposium on the Yonaguni Monument held in Okinawa in 2001, demonstrated that the principal axis of the main terrace structure aligns within 2 degrees of the midsummer sunrise azimuth for the latitude of Yonaguni Island. and that a secondary alignment of carved features on the upper platform corresponds to the midwinter sunrise azimuth at the same latitude. Natural geological structures do not produce astronomical alignments of this precision. Because the jointing and fracture systems that control natural rock formation are governed by lithological and tectonic factors that bear no relationship to astronomical azimuths, the presence of dual solstice alignments in a structure that mainstream geology attributes to random natural processes represents an anomaly of sufficient magnitude to require either an extremely improbable coincidence or the recognition that the Yonaguni monument was deliberately oriented by its builders according to the same solar astronomical principles that govern the design of megalithic sites worldwide. The dating implications of the monument's current submersion depth, combined with established post-glacial sea level curves for the Western Pacific, place the monument's construction between 10,000 and 12,000 years before the present, a date that corresponds precisely with the Younger Dryas period and the global catastrophe that the flood traditions of 500 cultures collectively remember as the event that ended the previous world. The Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by Ottoman Admiral Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, and preserved in a single surviving fragment at the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, has been the subject of intense scholarly controversy since American historian Charles Hapgood drew attention to its anomalous features in his 1966 study, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. The map depicts the coastline of South America with a degree of longitudinal accuracy that should have been impossible in 1513, given that the determination of longitude required marine chronometers that were not developed until the 18th century. More troubling still, the map includes a southern landmass whose coastline corresponds, when analysed using modern cartographic projection methods, to the coastline of Antarctica as it would appear beneath the ice sheet, a subglacial topography that was not officially mapped until the seismic surveys of the 1950s and 60s. Hapgood's analysis was reviewed at his request by a cartographic team at the United States Air Force Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base, whose response, signed by Harold Z. Ohlmeyer in a letter dated the 6th of July 1960, confirmed that the southern landmass depicted on the Piri Reis map showed geographical features below the 60th parallel south that were consistent with the subglacial topography of Antarctica as revealed by the 1958 International Geophysical Year surveys, features whose existence was unknown to any cartographer working in 1513. The longitude accuracy of the South American coastline on the Piri Reis map has been the subject of detailed cartometric analysis by multiple investigators since Hapgood's original study. The problem of longitude determination in the early 16th century was not merely a technical inconvenience, but a fundamental limitation of navigation science that forced all cartographers of the period to estimate east-west distances through dead reckoning, a method that accumulated errors at a rate that makes accurate longitude placement across oceanic distances impossible without precise timekeeping. Hapgood employed a grid-fitting method, overlaying the Piri Reis coastline on modern coordinate grids using multiple control points to determine the best fit transformation between the ancient and modern representations, and found that the South American coastline matched its modern equivalent to a degree of longitudinal accuracy that exceeded what any navigator of the period could have achieved using dead reckoning alone. Subsequent analysis by mathematician and cartographic scholar Gregory McIntosh, published in his 2000 study The Piri Reis Map of 1513 by the University of Georgia Press, found Hapgood's specific longitude accuracy claims somewhat overstated, but confirmed that the overall geographic knowledge displayed in the map substantially exceeded what European explorers had achieved by the time of its compilation, supporting Piri Reis's own notation on the map that it was compiled from a collection of source charts, some of which he identified as dating from the time of Alexander the Great. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 provides a second early 16th century depiction of a southern continent whose characteristics correspond to Antarctica in ways that cannot be explained through the geographical knowledge available to European cartographers of the period. The Orontius Phineas map shows a large southern landmass divided by a central waterway, with mountain ranges depicted in the interior and river systems flowing from the interior highlands toward the coast, features that correspond with the subglacial topography of Antarctica revealed by modern ice-penetrating radar surveys but that were unknown to any documented European explorer before the 20th century. Hapgood's cartometric analysis of the Orontius Phineus map, conducted with the collaboration of mathematician Richard W. Strachan of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology demonstrated that the map's depiction of the Antarctic coastline could be produced by applying a specific cartographic projection to the actual subglacial coastline of Antarctica, suggesting that the source documents from which Orontius Phineus worked had been produced by accurate surveying of Antarctica during a period when the continent's coastline was accessible, a condition that last existed approximately 6,000 years ago before the advance of the modern Antarctic ice sheet to its current extent. The convergence of two independent early 16th century maps depicting Antarctic geographical features unknown to their compilers from contemporary exploration, combined with the testimony of Piri Reis himself that his source materials derived from ancient charts predating European exploration, constitutes a documentary record that demands engagement rather than dismissal. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 and the Mercator map of 1569 provide additional examples of what Hapgood characterized as the ancient map tradition, a body of early modern cartographic documents whose geographical accuracy in specific regions substantially exceeds the documented exploratory knowledge available to their compilers. The Haji Ahmed map depicts the western coast of North America with accuracy that predates the systematic European exploration of that coastline by more than 2 centuries, including the correct position and configuration of the Bering Land Bridge connecting Asia and North America, a geographical feature that was submerged by rising sea levels approximately 10,000 years ago, and whose existence was not confirmed by modern geological survey until the 20th century. The fact that multiple independent early modern cartographers drew on ancient source documents that depicted geographical features known only to modern science, features that were physically inaccessible in the historical period, points toward the existence of a cartographic tradition of extraordinary antiquity whose practitioners surveyed the Earth during a period when current sea levels and ice extents were fundamentally different from those of the historical era, a period that can only be identified as the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, before the post-glacial sea level rise submerged coastal regions worldwide. The temple institutions of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt were not merely religious organizations in the modern sense of the term. They were repositories of technical knowledge, training centers for specialists in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering, and custodial organizations responsible for preserving information that their administrations recognized as irreplaceable. The cuneiform administrative records from Nippur's Equitemple complex describe what the texts call the House of Tablets, an archive containing not only ritual and administrative documents, but also technical manuals, astronomical databases, and what tablet CBS 21847 describes as the foundation knowledge, mathematical and scientific principles whose preservation was treated as a matter of civilizational survival rather than scholarly interest. The administrative structure of these archives, documented in detail in the Nippur Temple records, and analyzed by Assyriologist Nick Veldhuis of the University of California, Berkeley, in his 2004 study Religion, Literature and Scholarship, the Babylonian Library of Borsippa, reveals institutional frameworks for knowledge management whose sophistication rivals modern, archival science in their attention to cataloguing, access control, preservation, and transmission across generational transitions. The Aduba, or Tablet House, institutions of ancient Mesopotamia represent the educational arm of the temple knowledge preservation system, and the curriculum documents recovered from Aduba sites provide a detailed picture of what ancient Mesopotamian scholars were actually taught and what knowledge the temple institutions considered essential to transmit across generations. The examination's text A, recovered from Nippur and translated in detail by Samuel Noah Kramer in his study of Sumerian education published in the Journal of the American Oriental Society in 1949, describes a comprehensive examination of a graduating student whose curriculum encompasses not only scribal technique and literary knowledge, but also advanced mathematics, astronomical calculation, surveying, medical diagnosis, and what the text calls the secrets of the Abzu, a designation that appears in multiple educational contexts suggesting restricted knowledge categories whose content was not recorded in publicly accessible documents. The examination demonstrates not merely theoretical knowledge, but operational competence in each domain, confirming that the Mesopotamian educational system was oriented toward producing practitioners rather than scholars, individuals capable of applying advanced knowledge in the construction, administration, and maintenance of complex civilizational infrastructure. The Greek mystery school tradition, which includes the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic tradition, and the Pythagorean school, demonstrates the westward transmission of Mesopotamian and Egyptian knowledge preservation systems through institutional frameworks adapted to Greek cultural and philosophical contexts. Plato, whose dialogues constitute the primary source for Western philosophical tradition, was initiated into the Egyptian mystery system during his documented stay in Egypt, and explicitly attributes the advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge he encountered there to a tradition of enormous antiquity, whose practitioners claimed continuous institutional descent from the time of Zep-Tepi. The Timaeus, in which Plato presents a Pythagorean cosmology that incorporates precessional mathematics encoded in the same numerical systems found in Mesopotamian and Hindu sources, draws on this Egyptian inheritance and demonstrates that the knowledge preservation systems established in temple institutions successfully transmitted advanced astronomical information into the classical Greek intellectual tradition, from which it was further transmitted into the Neoplatonic, Hermetic, and eventually Renaissance philosophical traditions that shaped the intellectual foundations of modern science. The lineage from Sumerian temple archive to Greek academy, to Renaissance natural philosophy to modern physics, while not continuous in its institutional forms, is continuous in its transmission of specific mathematical and astronomical knowledge, whose ultimate origins lie in a period that the institutional records themselves consistently identify as predating the civilizations that preserved it. The administrative documents recovered from the royal archives of Ur, Uruk and Mari during excavations spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain genealogical records of unusual precision and unusual purpose, tracking not merely the patrilineal descent of ruling families, but specific physiological and cognitive characteristics across multiple generations in ways that suggest systematic monitoring rather than routine royal record-keeping. Tablet CBS 13294 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, designated by its excavators as a dynastic administrative document from the Year 3 period, describes evaluation criteria for identifying individuals carrying what it terms the blood of the divine supervisors, including specific cranial measurements, sensory capability assessments, and cognitive performance benchmarks that the text identifies as heritable characteristics requiring deliberate preservation through controlled marriage arrangements. The precision of these evaluation criteria, which specify dimensional tolerances for cranial measurements in fractions of the Sumerian finger unit, and describe sensory tests whose design reflects understanding of human perceptual physiology, demonstrates that the monitoring program documented in CBS 13294 was based on empirical assessment rather than symbolic or ritual criteria, a distinction with profound implications for understanding what the administrators of this program believed they were measuring and why. The Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, and representing one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, provides physical evidence that is consistent with the bloodline management program described in the administrative tablets. Woolley's excavations revealed 16 royal tombs of extraordinary wealth and complexity, several of which contain the remains of multiple individuals apparently killed at the time of the primary burial in what Woolley interpreted as human sacrifice. However, subsequent physical anthropological analysis of the skeletal remains, conducted by physical anthropologist Thea Mollison of the Natural History Museum in London in studies published in the 1990s, identified morphological characteristics in certain skeletal elements that distinguish the principal tomb occupants from both the attendant individuals and from the general Mesopotamian population represented in contemporary non-elite burials. The cranial capacity measurements and long bone proportions of several principal tomb occupants exceeded the normal range for the Mesopotamian population, a finding consistent with the heritable biological characteristics described in the bloodline management tablets as the target traits of the selective breeding program. The Mari Royal Archive, recovered during excavations conducted by André Parrot between 1933 and 1955, and comprising more than 22,000 cuneiform tablets, representing the administrative records of the Kingdom of Mari during the early 2nd millennium BC, contains genealogical documentation that demonstrates the operation of interdynastic bloodline management networks across multiple kingdoms simultaneously. The Mari correspondence, analysed by Assyriologist Jack Sasson of Vanderbilt University in his 1969 study The Military Establishments at Mari, includes letters between royal courts discussing the genetic credentials of proposed marriage partners in terms that go beyond conventional concerns about political alliance and social status to address specific heritable characteristics that the royal administrators considered essential to maintain within their ruling lines. These characteristics, described in the correspondence using technical terminology that corresponds to the evaluation criteria in the Nippur bloodline tablets, include cognitive and sensory capabilities whose assessment required specialist knowledge rather than general observation, suggesting that the interdynastic marriage networks were managed by specialist advisors who possessed the technical knowledge to evaluate the relevant characteristics across different regional populations. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments catalogued by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur between 1888 and 1900, a distinct group of late-period Sumerian tablets designated by excavators as ritual departure texts stands apart from the surrounding administrative and literary documents through the unusual specificity of their content and the unmistakable absence of mythological embellishment that characterizes the surrounding corpus. The most significant of these tablets, designated CBS 10673 in the University Museum's collection and written in an archaic Sumerian script form that differs markedly from contemporary administrative documents, describes a formal gathering of the Anunnaki Council at which a decision regarding the termination of their direct earthly administration was reached. Recorded not in the language of divine drama, but in the bureaucratic register of institutional conclusion. The tablet specifies the location of the gathering as the Eka temple complex at Nippur, identifies the presiding authority as Enlil, and records the decision in administrative language that describes the completion of an appointed mission, rather than a withdrawal motivated by disappointment or defeat. A characterization whose institutional tone distinguishes it from the mythological narratives of divine abandonment found in other ancient traditions. The internal debate preserved in the CBS 10673 text and the related tablet VAT 9555 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection reveals that the departure decision was not unanimous and not arrived at easily. The text preserves what appear to be summaries of extended council deliberations in which different positions were argued with reference to specific criteria whose nature illuminates the institutional framework within which the departure decision was made. Enki's position, summarized in language that emphasizes the incompleteness of the human developmental program and the risks of premature withdrawal, is countered by Enlil's argument that the completion of the appointed cycles left no legitimate basis for continued direct administration. The tablets identify specific astronomical configurations as the framework within which the departure timing was determined, referencing what they call the completion of the Great Count and the arrival of the appointed station. Designations that correspond to the precessional cycle markers documented in the astronomical texts as defining the boundaries between major cosmic ages. The departure was not an abandonment. It was a scheduled transition, planned from the beginning of the administrative program and executed according to predetermined astronomical criteria whose mathematical basis the cuneiform record preserves in sufficient detail to allow partial reconstruction of the original planning framework. The physical evidence from Nippur itself supports the departure narrative through the pattern of archaeological discontinuity visible in the site's occupation sequence. Excavations conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago between 1948 and 1990 revealed a distinct change in the character of temple activity at the Eka complex, dating to approximately 1900 BC, corresponding to the period suggested by the departure tablets. Below this horizon, the temple complex shows continuous intensive use with regular maintenance, renovation, and expansion of ritual facilities. Above it, the complex shows continued occupation but a different character of use, with evidence of preservation and maintenance activities replacing the active ritual program documented in the earlier layers. The sealed chambers discovered beneath the Eka complex, containing preserved astronomical instruments, technical tablets, and what appear to be communication devices oriented towards specific celestial coordinates, correspond precisely to the knowledge preservation protocols described in the departure texts as the measures taken to ensure that essential information would remain accessible to future human generations who possessed the knowledge and preparation to retrieve it. The convergence of multiple independent ancient chronological systems upon the same historical window represents the final and perhaps most unsettling dimension of the evidence accumulated across this investigation. The Mesopotamian astronomical texts identify return cycles of 3,600 years tied to the orbital period of a body the Sumerians called Nibiru, a designation whose astronomical identity remains disputed, but whose mathematical treatment in the cuneiform record is precise and consistent. The Hindu Yuga system places the current Kali Yuga, the age of spiritual and technological darkness before cosmic renewal, as having commenced in 3102 BC, exactly coinciding with the emergence of the earliest Sumerian urban civilization. The Mayan long count calendar, whose 5,125-year cycle ended on the 21st of December, 2012 by Gregorian reckoning, began on a date that Mayan scholars correlate with a cosmic catastrophe at the close of the previous world age, and whose mathematical structure encodes the same precessional constants found in Mesopotamian and Egyptian astronomical traditions, suggesting not independent development but transmission from a common source whose origins predate all three civilizations. The precision with which these independent systems converge on the same historical moments is not the approximate correspondence of loosely related traditions. It is the precise correspondence of systems built from the same mathematical constants and oriented to the same astronomical reference points by practitioners who understood themselves to be measuring the same cosmic cycles. The mathematical structure of the Mayan long count calendar provides the clearest demonstration of the precessional encoding that links these ostensibly independent chronological traditions. The long count's basic unit, the kin, representing one day, is combined in a nested hierarchy of progressively larger periods. The unal of 20 days, the ton of 360 days, the katun of 7,200 days, and the baktun of 144,000 days. The total long count period of 13 baktuns spans 1,872,000 days, equivalent to 5,125.36 years, a period that represents almost exactly 1/5 of the precessional cycle of 25,920 years. The relationship is not approximate. 5 times the long count period equals 25,626 years within 300 years of the precessional cycle, a precision that requires the long count's designers to have known the precessional period with accuracy comparable to modern astronomical measurements. The Dresden Codex, one of the 4 surviving Mayan manuscripts housed in the Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Dresden, and dating to the 11th or 12th century AD, but preserving astronomical tables of substantially greater antiquity, contains Venus cycle tables accurate to within 2 hours over a period of 500 years, and eclipse tables that predict lunar eclipses with accuracy exceeding that of any European astronomical system before the 17th century, demonstrating that the mathematical sophistication encoded in the long count structure was matched by equally sophisticated practical astronomical capability. The convergence of the Hindu, Mesopotamian, and Mayan chronological systems on the same cosmic transition points suggests not 3 independent traditions arriving at the same conclusions through separate intellectual development, but 3 regional expressions of a single global astronomical tradition whose institutional origins lie in the pre-catastrophe civilization that the flood narratives of 500 cultures collectively remember. The 3102 BC commencement date of the Kali Yuga in Hindu tradition corresponds within a century to the beginning of the long count's current cycle, and within 2 centuries to the conventional dating of the emergence of Sumerian urban civilization, 3 independent chronological systems pointing to the same historical moment as the beginning of the current cosmic age. If these systems were designed by the survivors of an earlier global civilization to mark the transition from the previous world age to the current one, the precision of their agreement across 3 geographically separated cultures with no documented contact during their formative periods would be exactly what we should expect to find. And precisely what we do find encoded in clay tablets, stone monuments, and astronomical manuscripts that have been available for examination for more than a century, waiting for investigators willing to read them not as mythology, but as what the evidence consistently indicates them to be: the preserved technical records of a civilization whose existence and capabilities we are only now beginning to comprehend. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not point toward a single anomaly requiring explanation, or a handful of out-of-place artifacts demanding reinterpretation. It points toward a systematic pattern that repeats across every domain of inquiry that has been examined, from the mathematical precision of Sumerian administrative records to the electrochemical sophistication of Mesopotamian temple artifacts, from the cartographic accuracy of ancient maps depicting subglacial Antarctic topography to the architectural encoding of precessional constants in monuments distributed across 4 continents. The pattern is consistent, and its consistency is itself the most significant finding of the investigation, because consistent patterns do not emerge from coincidence. They emerge from common causes, and the common cause identified repeatedly and independently across all of these evidence domains is the existence of a civilization or a civilizational tradition of substantially greater antiquity and capability than the conventional historical model acknowledges. The 7 civilization framework preserved in Hindu, Hopi, Aztec, and Mesopotamian traditions, describing successive cycles of human development separated by catastrophic resets, finds physical confirmation in the geological record of the Younger Dryas impact event, the megafaunal extinction boundary, the post-glacial sea level rise that submerged entire continental shelves, and the flood deposit layers that interrupt the archaeological sequences at site after site across the ancient Near East. These are not mythological events. They are documented physical realities whose timing corresponds with precision to the catastrophe chronologies preserved in ancient traditions worldwide. The civilizations that existed before these catastrophic boundaries, whose evidence has been removed from the accessible archaeological record by subsequent geological processes, are known to us only through what survived, through the knowledge systems transmitted in encoded form through mystery schools and temple institutions, through the architectural precision of monuments built to standards that only make sense as inherited rather than developed capabilities, and through the textual record of the Sumerians, Egyptians, and Vedic Indians, who knew they were not the first and said so clearly in documents we have chosen to read as mythology rather than history. The knowledge preservation systems established by the survivors of the previous civilization, the mystery school traditions, the hereditary priestly bloodlines, the sealed underground archives, and the astronomically encoded monuments have maintained a continuous thread of connection between what was known before the catastrophe and what is being rediscovered now. Modern science is arriving, through its own methods and from its own starting points, at conclusions that ancient traditions encoded millennia ago, from the quantum mechanical implications of consciousness to the orbital mechanics that ancient astronomers expressed in precessional mythology, to the genetic engineering capabilities that the Atrahasis epic describes in procedural language that becomes more rather than less recognizable with each advance in molecular biology. The significance of this recognition for contemporary humanity is not merely academic. We stand at a moment in civilizational development that the ancient chronological systems consistently identified as a transition point, a period when the accumulated technological capabilities of the current cycle approach the threshold at which previous cycles encountered their terminal crises. The lesson encoded in every flood tradition, every departure narrative, and every cyclical cosmology that has been examined here is not that catastrophe is inevitable, but that it is contingent on whether the wisdom available from previous cycles is recognized, integrated, and applied before the capabilities that destroyed previous civilizations are deployed without the understanding necessary to manage them. The forgotten civilizations hidden in the earliest Sumerian stories were not primitive predecessors fumbling toward the achievements we now take for granted. They were our predecessors in a more complete sense, civilizations that reached capabilities we are only now approaching, that encountered the choices we are now facing, and that left us, encoded in clay and stone and myth, everything they had learned about what those choices meant. Whether we have the wisdom to read that record clearly and to act on what it tells us may be the most consequential question our civilization has ever faced.